My younger sister told hundreds of guests I was faking my paralysis for pity. Then she grabbed my wheelchair and violently pulled me out of it, sending me crashing into a $1,000 champagne tower. What she did not see was the financial crimes detective already dialing 911 right behind her. If you have ever been the scapegoat of a toxic family, hit the like button and subscribe. Let me tell you exactly how I dismantled my family empire of lies, starting from the dark corner they tried to hide me in. My name is Sydney, and I am 29 years old. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of love. The engagement party for my younger sister Brianna and her fiancé Preston was in full swing. My parents, Reginald and Valerie, had rented out one of the most exclusive historical mansions in Atlanta, Georgia. The ballroom was draped in white silk and imported orchids. A live jazz band played softly in the background while waiters in crisp white shirts circulated with trays of expensive caviar. It was a flawless display of high society wealth designed specifically to impress Preston and his family. Preston claimed to be the heir to a massive technology fortune in Boston. My parents were absolutely obsessed with him. They saw his whiteness and his supposed wealth as the ultimate prize for their golden child. Meanwhile, I was the family secret they preferred to keep out of sight. I was stationed in a dimly lit alcove near the kitchen doors, completely hidden behind a massive floral arrangement. My wheelchair did not fit the perfect aesthetic my mother had curated for the evening. A year ago, a horrific car accident had left me paralyzed from the waist down. I had spent months in grueling physical therapy fighting through unimaginable pain just to regain some sense of normalcy. But to my family, my disability was nothing more than an embarrassing inconvenience. They treated me like a broken prop that needed to be stored away in the closet when company arrived. I sat quietly in my corner, nursing a glass of sparkling water and observing the room. As a senior forensic auditor, observing details was my specialty. My entire career was built on finding the hidden truths in corporate ledgers, spotting the tiny inconsistencies that exposed massive frauds. I was trained to see what others desperately wanted to hide, and looking around this opulent room, I saw plenty of lies. My mother, Valerie, detached herself from a group of wealthy socialites and marched toward my dark corner. Her smile dropped the second she was out of their sight. She wore a custom designer gown that hugged her figure perfectly, but the expression on her face was pure venom. She stopped right in front of my wheelchair and snatched the glass of water out of my hand. "What do you think you are doing, Sydney?" she hissed, keeping her voice low so the guests would not hear. I looked up at her calmly. "I am sitting exactly where you told me to sit, Mom. In the shadows away from the cameras." "Do not use that tone with me," she snapped. "You are ruining the aesthetic of the room. I specifically asked you to stay in the private guest suite upstairs until the main reception was over. Preston has very important relatives flying in from Massachusetts tonight. They come from old money, real money. The last thing we need is for them to see you sulking in that wheelchair and think our family has bad genetics." The cruelty of her words would have shattered me a year ago. Back then, I was still trying to earn her love. I was still trying to prove that I was just as worthy as Brianna. But surviving a near-fatal accident changes a person. It strips away the illusion of family loyalty and forces you to see reality. I knew exactly why my mother favored Brianna. Brianna was the beautiful, narcissistic golden child who performed the role of the perfect daughter. I was the analytical, quiet one who asked too many questions. "I am not sulking," I replied, folding my hands in my lap. "I am just observing the crowd. It is quite a production you have put together. How much is Reginald dipping into his savings for this single night?" Valerie glared at me, her eyes flashing with anger. "Your father and I are making an investment in your sister and her future. Preston comes from a billionaire family. When they get married, Brianna will be set for life. We are securing our legacy. You should be grateful we even allowed you to attend after the stunt you pulled last year." Her reference to the accident made my blood run cold, but I kept my face entirely neutral. The accident was the darkest secret our family held. But tonight was not the night to argue about the past. Tonight was about watching their house of cards begin to sway. I looked across the ballroom and spotted Preston. He was holding a glass of champagne, laughing loudly at a joke someone had made. He wore a tuxedo that looked expensive from a distance, but my trained eyes caught the slight bunching at the shoulders. It was an off-the-rack suit poorly tailored, but what truly caught my attention was the watch gleaming on his left wrist. "If Preston is a billionaire technology heir," I said softly, never taking my eyes off the groom-to-be. "Why is he wearing a cheap replica watch?" Valerie scoffed, rolling her eyes. "You have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. That watch is a limited edition masterpiece. He told us his grandfather bought it in Switzerland. It is worth more than your entire annual salary." I tilted my head, smiling a small, knowing smile. "A real mechanical watch of that caliber has a sweeping second hand, Mom. It moves in a smooth, continuous motion. Preston has a watch that ticks loudly exactly once per second. That means it has a cheap quartz movement inside. You can buy that exact counterfeit model online for about $200. Valerie stepped back as if I had physically struck her. She looked over at Preston, then back at me, her face flushed with a mixture of panic and fury. She did not want to believe me, but she knew I never made mistakes when it came to money and assets. My entire job was valuing high net worth estates. If I said the watch was fake, it was fake. But rather than question the man who was about to marry her golden child, Valerie chose her favorite defense mechanism. She attacked me. "You are so bitter, Sydney," she whispered, leaning down so her face was inches from mine. "You are just jealous because Brianna is getting everything you will never have. You are paralyzed, alone, and completely miserable. You cannot stand the fact that a successful, wealthy man chose your sister instead of you. So you sit in this corner and make up ridiculous lies to try and tear them down. It is pathetic." I did not flinch. I let her harsh words wash over me, knowing that her willful ignorance was going to be her ultimate downfall. "I am not jealous, Mom. I am just doing math. And right now the numbers are not adding up." "You need to shut your mouth," Valerie commanded, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at me. "Do not say a single word to anyone tonight. Do not talk to Preston. Do not talk to Brianna. Just sit here in your wheelchair and keep quiet. If you ruin this engagement party, I swear to God I will make you regret it." She turned on her heel and stormed away, rushing back into the glittering crowd to pretend she was the happiest mother in the world. I watched her rejoin the wealthy socialites, a fake smile plastered across her face as she accepted their compliments. I picked up my glass of water and took a slow sip. The jazz music swelled, masking the sound of laughter and clinking crystal. I was completely alone in the shadows, just as they wanted me to be. But what my mother failed to realize was that the shadows are the best place to operate when you are preparing to dismantle an empire. I reached into the small bag attached to the side of my wheelchair and felt the cold, hard edge of a decrypted flash drive. It contained enough evidence to send multiple people in this room to federal prison. Preston and his fake watch was just the beginning. The real devastation was coming, and I was going to enjoy every single second of it. As I sat there waiting for the inevitable disaster to unfold, my phone buzzed quietly in my lap. It was a secure text message from Detective Harrison, a financial crimes investigator I had been secretly meeting with for the past 3 weeks. The message was brief but powerful. "We are in position outside the gates. Give the signal when you are ready." I typed a quick reply. "Wait for the toast. They're going to put on a show." I slid the phone back into my pocket. My heart beat with a steady, rhythmic thrum. There was no fear left in me, only a cold, calculated anticipation. I watched Preston put his arm around my sister Brianna, pulling her close for a photo. They looked like a magazine cover, the perfect wealthy couple destined for greatness. Brianna threw her head back and laughed, the massive diamond engagement ring catching the light of the chandeliers. It was a flawless performance. But I knew the diamond was cubic zirconia, just like I knew the trust fund Preston bragged about did not exist. I knew exactly how deep the rot went in this family. They thought they could silence me by pushing me into a corner. They thought my wheelchair made me weak, invisible, and easy to control. They were about to learn a very painful lesson about underestimating the scapegoat. The music stopped abruptly, and a loud voice echoed through the ballroom, calling for everyone to gather around. It was time for the champagne tower. It was time for the show to begin. The grand ballroom fell completely silent as Preston tapped his crystal glass with a silver spoon. He stood at the center of the room beside a magnificent champagne tower that must have cost at least $1,000. The tower was a glittering pyramid of fragile crystal, reflecting the warm light of the chandeliers above. Brianna stood next to him wearing a triumphant smile. This was her moment. She thrived on having every single eye in the room focused entirely on her. I sat in my dark alcove, keeping my expression perfectly blank as I watched them prepare for their toast. Preston took the microphone first. He thanked the wealthy guests for coming, making sure to drop several fake references to his non-existent family trust fund in Boston. The crowd murmured in polite admiration, completely fooled by his performance. Then he handed the microphone to my sister. Brianna took a deep breath and looked out over the sea of high society faces. She thanked our parents for the extravagant party and spoke about how perfectly her life was falling into place. But Brianna could never just enjoy her own success. She always needed a victim to elevate herself. Her eyes scanned the room, purposely searching past the bright lights until they locked onto my wheelchair in the shadows. My sister raised the microphone to her lips, and her smile twisted into something cruel. She told the crowd that tonight was about moving forward, despite the heavy burdens her family had been forced to carry. She pointed directly at me, ensuring that hundreds of heads turned to stare into the dark corner where my mother had hidden me. Brianna let out a dramatic sigh, playing the role of the exhausted, deeply burdened sibling. She told everyone that I had been struggling with severe jealousy ever since she got engaged to a successful man. And then, without an ounce of hesitation, my younger sister told a room full of strangers that I was faking my paralysis. Gasps echoed through the ballroom. I could feel the collective shock of the crowd pressing down on me. Brianna leaned into the microphone and declared that doctors had cleared me months ago, but I insisted on staying in the wheelchair just to steal pity and attention away from her special night. She called me a pathetic manipulator who could not handle the fact that she was the one getting married. Preston stepped up right beside her, laughing into the microphone. He told the audience to ignore the bitter welfare case in the corner, claiming that every wealthy family unfortunately had one relative trying to drag them down. My parents stood in the front row. They did not try to stop the speech. They did not defend me. Reginald and Valerie just looked down at their expensive shoes, allowing Preston and Brianna to assassinate my character in front of the entire Atlanta elite. They cared more about securing their fake billionaire son-in-law than protecting their disabled daughter from public humiliation. I did not react. I did not yell back or try to defend myself. I just sat in my chair calculating every single move they were making. But my silence only infuriated Brianna more. She wanted a reaction. She wanted a screaming match so she could prove to her guests that I was the unstable, jealous sister she claimed I was. When I simply stared back at her with calm, steady eyes, Brianna snapped. She handed the microphone to Preston and marched across the ballroom floor. The crowd parted for her like the Red Sea. Her expensive designer gown swished angrily around her ankles as she closed the distance between us. I braced myself, gripping the armrests of my wheelchair. Brianna stopped right in front of me, her chest heaving with rage. She hissed that I was ruining her life and that she was going to expose my lies once and for all. Before I could even process what she was planning, Brianna reached out and grabbed the metal frame of my wheelchair. She dug her manicured nails into my arms, her face contorted with malice. She screamed at me to stop faking it and stand up. Then, with a sudden violent jerk, she yanked me forward. The force of her pull lifted me completely out of the seat. For a split second, I was suspended in the air, my legs unable to support my weight. Gravity took over immediately. I pitched forward, unable to catch myself. I flew past Brianna and tumbled directly toward the center of the room. I crashed violently into the massive champagne tower. The sound of shattering crystal was deafening. Hundreds of expensive glasses exploded outward in a spectacular wave of destruction. Gallons of sticky sweet champagne rained down on my hair and soaked through my dress. I hit the hard marble floor with a sickening thud, the breath knocked completely out of my lungs. Heavy shards of broken glass rained down on top of me, slicing through the fabric of my clothes and biting deep into my skin. Screams erupted from the guests. Women in designer dresses jumped back to avoid the flying glass and spilled alcohol. I lay there in the center of the devastation, surrounded by a jagged sea of broken crystal. A sharp burning pain radiated through my right arm and shoulder, where a large piece of a shattered champagne flute had sliced into me. Warm blood began to mix with the cold champagne pooling on the marble floor beneath me. I gasped for air, staring up at the grand chandelier spinning above my head. The physical pain was intense, but my mind remained incredibly sharp. I did not move my legs. I stayed perfectly still in the wreckage, playing the role they had forced me into. Brianna stood over me, breathing heavily, staring at the absolute disaster she had just created. She looked at the blood seeping through my sleeve, but there was no remorse in her eyes, only pure narcissistic fury that her expensive champagne tower was ruined. She had wanted to prove I was faking, but instead she had just committed a brutal assault in front of hundreds of witnesses. And I knew my secret ally was watching everything unfold, from the shadows, waiting perfectly to finally strike back at their carefully built empire of vicious, transparent lies. The music completely stopped, leaving a suffocating silence in the grand ballroom. The only sound was the dripping of expensive champagne falling from the marble table onto the floor. My arm throbbed intensely where the jagged crystal had sliced my skin. Blood pooled around my fingers, mixing with the sticky sweet liquid. I lay perfectly still amidst the wreckage, trying to control my breathing. The wealthy guests formed a wide circle around me, staring in absolute shock. Brianna just stood there looking down at me. She looked furious that her perfect moment had been hijacked by my bleeding body. I waited for someone to step forward to offer a hand or call a doctor, but nobody moved. They were all waiting to see how my family would handle this embarrassing spectacle. Heavy footsteps echoed across the marble floor, breaking the tense silence. I turned my head slightly and saw my father marching toward me. Reginald always wore custom-tailored suits and carried himself with absolute authority. He pushed past the whispering guests with his jaw clenched tightly. For a fraction of a second, the little girl inside me hoped my father was coming to help me up. I hoped he would feel some basic parental instinct to protect his injured daughter. Instead, he stopped at the edge of the glass and glared down at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. He did not ask if I was okay. Reginald bent down, grabbed my shoulder, and yanked me upward just enough to deliver a stinging backhanded slap across my face. The crack of his hand striking my cheek echoed through the silent ballroom. My head snapped to the side as the metallic taste of blood filled my mouth. The crowd let out a collective gasp, but my father ignored them. He leaned in close, his face twisted with rage, and hissed that I was a worthless embarrassment. He told me I had deliberately destroyed his younger daughter's big night because I was a bitter cripple. My mother, Valerie, hurried over, carefully stepping over the shattered crystal to protect her designer shoes. She ignored my bleeding arm and ordered the catering staff to clean up the mess immediately, apologizing to the guests for my supposed mental instability. Preston wrapped his arms around Brianna, playing the protective fiancé. He told the crowd that I was having a psychotic episode. Brianna squeezed out fake tears, burying her face in his chest, while Valerie rubbed her back. They were spinning the narrative in real time, turning my brutal assault into a story about a tragic family dealing with an unhinged, disabled sister. I lay back down on this cold floor, letting my cheek rest against the wet marble. My face burned from the slap, and my arm continued to bleed, but a deep sense of satisfaction began to wash over me. They had played their parts perfectly. They had demonstrated their cruelty in front of hundreds of high society witnesses. More importantly, they had committed a serious crime while blinded by their own narcissism. They thought their wealth and status would force everyone to accept their twisted version of events, but they had forgotten about the shadows. A tall man wearing a dark, tailored suit stepped forward from the back of the crowd. He moved with a calm, deliberate authority that instantly commanded the room. It was Detective Harrison. He walked directly through the circle of guests, ignoring the frantic catering staff. Reginald stood up straight, puffing out his chest, and demanding to know who this man was and why he was interfering with private family business. My father tried to intimidate the stranger with his booming executive voice. But Detective Harrison did not blink. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a leather wallet. He flipped the wallet open, revealing a shining silver badge. The murmurs in the ballroom instantly died down. He introduced himself loudly and clearly as a financial crimes detective with the Atlanta Police Department. Valerie froze in place, her hand hovering over Brianna. Preston took a small, terrified step backward. Harrison held up his cell phone, letting the screen illuminate his serious face. He announced to my parents and the entire crowd that he had just witnessed a felony assault on a disabled person. He stated that he had already contacted the dispatcher and that an ambulance along with police patrol units were currently on their way to the mansion. Total panic erupted among the wealthy guests. People began whispering frantically, grabbing their coats and making immediate moves toward the grand exit. No one wanted to be associated with a highly public police investigation or a violent felony assault charge. The flawless aesthetic my mother had obsessed over was destroyed. Valerie began to tremble violently, stammering aloud that this was all a terrible misunderstanding and that I had simply fallen out of my chair by accident. Reginald desperately tried to step forward to smooth things over, attempting to use his charm and influence to negotiate with the uncompromising detective. He offered to step into a private back room to clear up the confusion, promising that our family could gracefully handle our own domestic disputes without involving the local authorities. Detective Harrison shook his head and instructed my father to step away from the crime scene immediately. He crouched down beside me, ignoring the champagne soaking his trousers. Looking at my bleeding arm and my swollen cheek, he asked if I wanted to press charges against the woman who pushed me and the man who hit me. I looked past the detective and met my sister's terrified eyes. Brianna was gripping Preston's arm, her makeup ruined by panic as she realized the severity of her actions. I turned my gaze to my parents, who were staring at me with pure horror. They silently pleaded with me to protect them and fall back into my role as the obedient scapegoat who always took the blame. I took a painful breath and looked back at the detective. I told him clearly that I wanted to press full charges against both of them. The wail of police sirens grew loud in the distance. Red and blue flashing lights reflected through the ballroom windows, casting an eerie glow over the shattered champagne tower. My family stood frozen, finally realizing there was absolutely no turning back. The harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency room felt like a brutal awakening. The doctor carefully stitched the deep gash on my right arm. The local anesthetic numbed the sharpest edges of the pain, but I could still feel the dull tugging of the needle pulling my skin together. My cheek throbbed, a constant physical reminder of my father's heavy hand. The quiet beep of the heart monitor was the only sound in the sterile room. The physical wounds were significant, but they paled in comparison to the absolute clarity I felt in my mind. Detective Harrison had ridden in the ambulance, ensuring no one from my family could intercept the paramedics or silence me before we reached the hospital. He promised to keep a patrol officer stationed right outside the emergency ward. But I knew my parents. I knew a single police officer would not be enough to stop Reginald and Valerie when their precious social reputation was hanging by a thread. They were going to find a way into this room. I was completely ready for them. The heavy wooden door to my hospital room swung open with a violent shove. It slammed against the wall stopper, making the attending nurse jump. My father marched into the room first, his face still flushed a deep, angry red. He looked completely unhinged, stripped of the polished executive persona he usually wore like armor. My mother followed close behind, clutching her designer purse so tightly her knuckles were white. Valerie pushed the terrified nurse aside and slammed the door, sealing us inside. Neither of them bothered to look at the fresh stitches running down my arm. They did not ask the doctor about the extent of my injuries or if I needed pain medication. Their eyes were locked directly on my face, holding zero parental concern. They looked at me as if I was a massive inconvenient problem that needed to be erased immediately. The doctor tried to intervene, telling my parents I needed rest, and this was a restricted medical area. Reginald turned his furious gaze toward the doctor and used his deepest threatening voice to demand the room be cleared at once. He threatened to have the doctor fired by the hospital board if he did not leave us alone. The doctor hesitated, looking at me for confirmation. I gave him a small nod, indicating it was okay to leave. I wanted them to say everything they came here to say. As soon as the door clicked shut, my father stepped right up to the edge of my hospital bed. He planted his hands on the mattress and leaned over me, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me into submission. "Call that detective right now and tell him you are dropping the charges," my father ordered, his voice trembling with rage. "Tell him you slipped out of that chair by accident because you were clumsy. Say Brianna was only trying to catch you before you fell. Do you understand me, Sydney? You are not going to ruin your sister's life over a petty grudge." I looked up at him, maintaining a perfectly steady breathing pattern. "I am not dropping anything," I replied, my voice calm and completely flat. She grabbed my chair and pulled me out of it. "She assaulted me in front of hundreds of people. And then you hit me. You both belong in handcuffs, and I am going to make sure that is exactly where you end up." Valerie let out a sharp, frantic sound that was half scream and half sob. She rushed forward, shoving my father aside to get closer to my face. She looked absolutely deranged, her perfect makeup smeared from crying over her ruined social event. "You selfish, ungrateful little brat," she hissed, pointing a trembling finger at my chest. "How dare you sit there and threaten us after everything we have done for you?" Preston's family left the venue in complete disgust. The catering staff took videos of Brianna crying in the back of a police cruiser. "Our reputation in Atlanta is destroyed because you could not just sit in your corner and be quiet." I stared back at her without a single ounce of sympathy. My sister committed a felony, Mom. "That is not my fault." Valerie lost whatever tiny shred of composure she had left. She slammed her hands down on the metal bed rail, shaking the entire mattress. "You owe her, Sydney!" she screamed, her voice echoing off the sterile walls. "You owe your sister this favor. If you had not taken the blame for that drunk driving crash last year, Brianna's law school dreams would be completely dead." The ugly truth finally hung in the open air, exposing our toxic family dynamic. A year ago, Brianna had gotten behind the wheel of my car after drinking 4 martinis at a country club brunch. She was driving recklessly and wrapped the vehicle around a concrete pillar. I was in the passenger seat. The impact crushed my spine and left me paralyzed. Before the police arrived, my parents had dragged Brianna's unconscious body out of the driver's seat and forced me to take the blame. They told the cops I was the one driving to protect Brianna's spotless record for her law school applications. They sacrificed my physical mobility and my clean record just to keep their golden child shining. I looked at my mother, letting the silence stretch out for a heavy moment. "You traded my ability to walk so your favorite daughter could go to a prestigious school," I said softly. "I spent 6 months in rehabilitation, learning how to live in a wheelchair, while Brianna was out shopping for wedding dresses. I do not owe her a single thing. I have paid my debt to this family with my own blood and my own spine." Reginald slammed his fist against the wall. "We paid your medical bills, you ungrateful witch. We kept a roof over your head. If you do not call that detective and drop these charges tonight, we will cut off your physical therapy funding. You will be out on the street by morning." I smiled at him, a cold, calculating smile that made him pause. "Go ahead," I whispered. "Cut me off, because I am never dropping those charges." The harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency room replaced the glittering chandeliers of the mansion. The transition from the extravagant engagement party to this sterile medical environment felt like a sharp physical blow. The attending physician carefully cleaned the deep gash on my right arm where the champagne flute had sliced through my skin. The sharp scent of medical antiseptic filled the small room, masking the lingering smell of expensive alcohol that still soaked my ruined dress. The local anesthetic had numbed the worst of the searing pain, but I could still feel the dull, heavy tug of the needle as the doctor pulled my flesh together, stitch by stitch. My cheek throbbed with a dull, burning ache, serving as a constant physical reminder of my father's. Heavy hands striking my face, the steady, rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound, breaking the heavy silence. While the physical wounds were significant, they paled in comparison to the absolute mental clarity I felt. Right now, Detective Harrison had ridden in the back of the ambulance with me, ensuring that no one from my highly connected family could intercept the paramedics or attempt to silence me before we reached the hospital doors. He promised to keep a uniformed patrol officer stationed directly outside the emergency ward to protect me. But I knew my parents better than anyone else did. I knew a single police officer would not be nearly enough to stop Reginald and Valerie when their precious social reputation was hanging by a literal thread. They were going to find a way past security and into this room. I was completely ready for them. The heavy wooden door to my hospital room swung open with a violent shove that made the metal hinges groan. It slammed against the wall. Stopper, causing the attending nurse to jump in pure shock. My father marched into the small room. First, his face still flushed a deep angry red. He looked completely unhinged and entirely stripped of the polished executive persona he usually wore like a protective shield. My mother followed close behind him, clutching her designer purse so tightly that her knuckles were bone white. Valerie shoved the terrified nurse aside and slammed the heavy door shut, sealing us inside the room. Neither of my parents bothered to look at the fresh, bloody stitches running down my arm. They did not ask the doctor about the extent of my injuries or if I needed any pain medication. Their eyes were locked directly onto my face, holding absolutely zero parental concern. They looked at me as if I was a massive inconvenient problem that needed to be erased immediately. The doctor tried to intervene, telling my parents that I needed rest and stating clearly that this was a restricted medical treatment area. Reginald turned his furious dark gaze toward the physician and used his deepest threatening voice to demand the room be cleared at once. He threatened to have the doctor fired by the hospital board of directors if he did not leave. Us alone this instant? The doctor hesitated, looking at me for confirmation. I gave him a small, firm nod, indicating it was completely fine to leave. I wanted my parents to say everything they came here to say. As soon as the door clicked shut, my father stepped right up to the edge of my hospital bed. He planted his large hands on the mattress and leaned his heavy frame over me, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me into complete submission. Call that detective right now and tell him you are dropping all the charges my father ordered, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. Tell him you slipped out of that wheelchair by accident because you were clumsy and ruined the moment. Say your sister was only trying to catch you before you hit the ground. Do you understand me, Sydney? You are not going to ruin your sister's entire life over a petty, childish grudge. I looked up at him, maintaining a perfectly steady breathing pattern. I am not dropping anything, I replied, my voice perfectly calm and completely flat. She grabbed my chair and violently pulled me out of it. She assaulted me in front of hundreds of people. And then you walked over and hit me. You both belong in handcuffs, and I am going to make sure that is exactly where you end up tonight. Valerie let out a sharp, frantic sound that was half scream and half sob. She rushed forward, shoving my father aside to get closer to my face. She looked absolutely deranged, her perfect, expensive makeup smeared from crying over her ruined social event. You selfish, ungrateful little brat, she hissed, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at my chest. How dare you sit there and threaten us after everything we have done to provide for you? Preston's family left the venue in complete disgust. The catering staff took videos of Brianna crying in the back of a police cruiser. Our flawless reputation in Atlanta is destroyed because you could not just sit in your dark corner and be quiet. I stared back at her without a single ounce of sympathy. My sister committed a violent felony. Mom, that is not my fault. Valerie lost whatever tiny shred of composure she had left. She slammed her hands down on the metal bed rail, shaking the entire mattress beneath me. You owe her, Sydney! She screamed, her shrill voice echoing off the sterile white walls. You owe your sister this favor right now. If you had not taken the blame for that drunk driving crash last year, Brianna's law school dreams would be completely dead. The ugly truth finally hung in the open air, exposing our toxic family dynamic for exactly what it was. A year ago, Brianna got drunk driving and wrapped my car around a concrete pillar, leaving me paralyzed. They forced me to take the fall. I stared right back into Valerie, angry eyes. "I am never dropping those charges," I whispered, cold and unyielding. "Cut my funding entirely if you must, because I owe her nothing. You sacrificed my spine just to protect her law school application." Reginald yelled, a curse punching the wall, but I just smiled at them both, fully ready to bring down this entire corrupt empire. My father pulled his bleeding fist away from the dented hospital wall and stormed out of the room with my mother trailing closely behind him. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, leaving me entirely alone in the quiet, sterile space. I took a deep, steadying breath and leaned my head back against the thin white pillows. The dull throbbing in my cheek and the burning ache in my stitched arm were still there, but they were completely overshadowed by the sharp, cold focus taking over my mind. They had played their final, desperate hand. They had tried intimidation and violent threats, but I was no longer the broken, helpless girl they could manipulate. I reached over to the small plastic tray table next to my bed, where the nurse had carefully placed my personal belongings. My cell phone buzzed violently against the hard plastic surface, vibrating with a continuous angry rhythm. The screen lit up with a notification from my younger sister. I picked up the device and slowly swiped across the glass to open the incoming message. Brianna had not sent a single word of genuine apology. There was absolutely no remorse for the brutal assault that had landed me in the emergency room earlier that night. Instead, she had sent a photograph. I stared at the high-resolution image on my phone screen, feeling a wave of icy calm wash over me. The picture showed the sprawling front lawn of my parents' massive Atlanta estate, scattered carelessly across the manicured green grass, were all of my personal belongings. My expensive work clothes were dumped into the muddy dirt. My custom physical therapy equipment was tossed near the edge of the paved driveway. The specialized medical cushions I needed for my wheelchair were piled up next to overflowing black garbage bags. A second-long message popped up underneath the cruel photograph Brianna typed, that I was officially evicted from the family guest house, effective immediately. She told me that since I wanted to act like a hostile stranger and press felony assault charges against my own blood, I could go find somewhere else to live. She added that the private landscaping crew was scheduled to throw everything left on the lawn into the local neighborhood dumpster by morning, so I better figure out how to carry my trash away in my wheelchair. She ended the vicious text by saying she was currently out shopping for her designer wedding gown with her bridesmaids because she absolutely refused to let a bitter, crippled sister ruin her perfect celebration week. A year ago, seeing my entire life tossed onto the street like useless garbage would have completely broken my spirit. I would have sobbed uncontrollably in this hospital bed and begged them to forgive me. I would have called my mother, pleading for a second chance to simply be part of the family again. But as I looked at the photograph of my ruined belongings scattered in the dirt, I did not shed a single tear. My eyes remained perfectly dry. My heart beat with a steady, deliberate, and powerful rhythm. They thought taking away my physical shelter would render me helpless and compliant. They assumed my wheelchair meant I was completely dependent on their wealth and their toxic generosity. They had absolutely no idea who they were actually dealing with. I carefully shifted my weight on the rigid hospital bed, ignoring the sharp, sudden sting in my stitched arm. I reached down to the heavy leather medical bag, resting on the linoleum floor beside me. Detective Harrison had personally ensured it was brought with me in the back of the ambulance. Hidden safely beneath a layer of spare clothes and standard medical paperwork was my secure encrypted laptop. I pulled the heavy silver machine onto my lap and popped open the screen. The familiar bright glow of the monitor illuminated the dark shadows of the hospital room. This laptop was my real weapon. It was the exact tool I used as a senior forensic auditor to dismantle corrupt corporate empires and expose hidden offshore bank accounts. I typed in a long, complex string of passwords and completed the biometric authentications. The screen transitioned smoothly into my highly secure private auditing portal. I had spent the last 12 months sitting quietly in my wheelchair, tracking every single financial movement my family made. I knew exactly where every dollar came from and exactly where it went. I had direct backdoor access to routing numbers, offshore trusts, and hidden shell companies my father thought were completely untraceable. But right now, my attention was entirely focused on one very specific piece of plastic. I navigated through the encrypted server, bypassing several basic commercial firewalls until I accessed the primary banking network connected to my parents' joint accounts. I pulled up the real-time transaction ledger for the platinum credit card Brianna was currently holding in her manicured hand. The digital ledger populated instantly with rows of fresh data. Brianna was certainly not wasting any time. She was currently standing inside one of the most exclusive bridal boutiques in downtown Atlanta. The transaction history showed she had just authorized a preliminary charge for $15,000 to cover the non-refundable deposit on a custom-imported silk wedding dress. I could easily picture the scene playing out. She was likely sipping complimentary champagne and playing the role of the blushing wealthy bride while her fake friends fawned over her. She was doing all of this while my clothes sat rotting on the damp grass outside her house. She felt completely untouchable, believing the family money would forever shield her from the consequences of her violent criminal actions. I hovered my cursor over the active credit account. My fingers danced rapidly across the keyboard, writing a swift override command that triggered the central bank's extreme fraud protection protocol. I did not just freeze the single card Brianna was holding. I initiated a comprehensive lock on the entire primary credit line, rendering every single piece of plastic linked to that specific account completely useless. I hit the enter key and watched with deep satisfaction as the status on my screen changed from active to suspended due to suspected fraudulent activity. I leaned back against the thin hospital pillows, imagining the exact scene unfolding at the luxury bridal boutique. Right at this very second, Brianna would be standing at the polished marble checkout counter offering her most condescending smile to the retail associates. She would hand over the heavy metal credit card, expecting the massive transaction to slide through with unquestioned immediate approval. The associate would swipe the card once, then try again with a confused, polite apology. The small digital terminal would blink a bright red declined message for everyone to see. Brianna would demand they try it again, her voice rising in typical entitled panic. She would dig into her designer purse and offer a different card linked to the same account, only to watch that one decline as well. The wealthy elite women in the boutique would stop browsing and turn to stare at the embarrassed, angry bride who could not even afford to pay her own basic deposit. The flawless image of the wealthy golden child would crack right there in the middle of the expensive store, surrounded by the exact society, people she desperately wanted to impress. She thought she could throw me out like trash and continue her luxurious shopping spree without a single disruption to her perfect day. She assumed the family money would always flow freely, protecting her from the harsh reality of the real world. But I was the one controlling the financial valve now. I closed my laptop and set it carefully on the tray table next to me. The screen went black, reflecting my calm, composed face in the dim hospital room. This was only the very first strike in a much larger war. They wanted to play a ruthless game of power and control. I was more than ready to show them exactly what happens when you force a forensic auditor into a corner and leave her with absolutely nothing left to lose. The eviction text was their final fatal mistake. My counterattack had officially begun, and I was not going to stop until their entire fraudulent empire burned to the ground. The harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency room felt like a brutal awakening. The doctor carefully stitched the deep gash on my right arm. The local anesthetic numbed the sharpest edges of the pain, but I could still feel the dull tugging of the needle pulling my skin together. My cheek throbbed, a constant physical reminder of my father's heavy hand. The quiet beep of the heart monitor was the only sound in the sterile room. The physical wounds were significant, but they paled in comparison to the absolute clarity I felt in my mind. Detective Harrison had ridden in the ambulance, ensuring no one from my family could intercept the paramedics or silence me before we reached the hospital. He promised to keep a patrol officer stationed right outside the emergency ward, but I knew my parents. I knew a single police officer would not be enough to stop Reginald and Valerie when their precious social reputation was hanging by a thread. They were going to find a way into this room. I was completely ready for them. The heavy wooden door to my hospital room swung open with a violent shove. It slammed against the wall stopper, making the attending nurse jump. My father marched into the room first, his face still flushed a deep, angry red. He looked completely unhinged, stripped of the polished executive persona he usually wore like armor. My mother followed close behind, clutching her designer purse so tightly her knuckles were white. Valerie pushed the terrified nurse aside and slammed the door, sealing us inside. Neither of them bothered to look at the fresh stitches running down my arm. They did not ask the doctor about the extent of my injuries or if I needed pain medication. Their eyes were locked directly on my face, holding zero parental concern. They looked at me as if I was a massive, inconvenient problem that needed to be erased immediately. The doctor tried to intervene, telling my parents I needed rest, and this was a restricted medical area. Reginald turned his furious gaze toward the doctor and used his deepest, threatening voice to demand the room be cleared at once. He threatened to have the doctor fired by the hospital board if he did not leave us alone. The doctor hesitated, looking at me for confirmation. I gave him a small nod, indicating it was okay to leave. I wanted them to say everything they came here to say. As soon as the door clicked shut, my father stepped right up to the edge of my hospital bed. He planted his hands on the mattress and leaned over me, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me into submission. "Call that detective right now and tell him you are dropping the charges," my father ordered, his voice trembling with rage. "Tell him you slipped out of that chair by accident because you were clumsy. Say Brianna was only trying to catch you before you fell. Do you understand me, Sydney? You are not going to ruin your sister's life over a petty grudge." I looked up at him, maintaining a perfectly steady breathing pattern. "I am not dropping anything," I replied, my voice calm and completely flat. She grabbed my chair and pulled me out of it. She assaulted me in front of hundreds of people. "And then you hit me. You both belong in handcuffs, and I am going to make sure that is exactly where you end up." Valerie let out a sharp, frantic sound that was half scream and half sob. She rushed forward, shoving my father aside to get closer to my face. She looked absolutely deranged, her perfect makeup smeared from crying over her ruined social event. "You selfish, ungrateful little brat," she hissed, pointing a trembling finger at my chest. "How dare you sit there and threaten us after everything we have done for you?" Preston's family left the venue in complete disgust. The catering staff took videos of Brianna crying in the back of a police cruiser. "Our reputation in Atlanta is destroyed because you could not just sit in your corner and be quiet." I stared back at her without a single ounce of sympathy. "My sister committed a felony, Mom. That is not my fault." Valerie lost whatever tiny shred of composure she had left. She slammed her hands down on the metal bedrail, shaking the entire mattress. "You owe her, Sydney," she screamed, her voice echoing off the sterile walls. "You owe your sister this favor. If you had not taken the blame for that drunk driving crash last year, Brianna's law school dreams would be completely dead." The ugly truth finally hung in the open air, exposing our toxic family dynamic. A year ago, Brianna had gotten behind the wheel of my car after drinking 4 martinis at a country club brunch. She was driving recklessly and wrapped the vehicle around a concrete pillar. I was in the passenger seat. The impact crushed my spine and left me paralyzed. Before the police arrived, my parents had dragged Brianna's unconscious body out of the driver's seat and forced me to take the blame. They told the cops I was the one driving to protect Brianna's spotless record for her law school applications. They sacrificed my physical mobility and my clean record just to keep their golden child shining. I looked at my mother, letting the silence stretch out for a heavy moment. "You traded my ability to walk so your favorite daughter could go to a prestigious school," I said softly. "I spent 6 months in rehabilitation learning how to live in a wheelchair while Brianna was out shopping for wedding dresses. I do not owe her a single thing. I have paid my debt to this family with my own blood and my own spine." Reginald slammed his fist against the wall. "We paid your medical bills, you ungrateful witch. We kept a roof over your head. If you do not call that detective and drop these charges tonight, we will cut off your physical therapy funding. You will be out on the street by morning." I smiled at him, a cold, calculating smile that made him pause. Go ahead, I whispered. Cut me off. Because I am never going to drop those serious criminal charges against her. The quiet hum of the hospital ventilation system filled the room as I stared at the blank screen of my laptop. My heart rate had finally settled into a calm, steady rhythm. I had just initiated the destruction of my younger sisters. Flawless wedding preparations, but I knew I could not afford to dwell on that small victory for too long. The real war required my complete, absolute focus. I carefully placed the laptop back inside my medical bag and pushed it under the bed. The hospital room felt incredibly still. The chaotic energy my parents had brought into the space was completely gone, replaced by the sterile, cold reality of the emergency ward. I watched the clock sweep in a smooth, continuous circle. I knew exactly who was coming next, and I knew we had a very narrow window of time to finalize our strategy. Before the hospital administration moved me to a standard recovery room, a soft, rhythmic knock sounded against the heavy wooden door. It was a specific pattern we had agreed upon weeks ago. I sat up slightly, adjusting the thin blankets around my waist, and called out for the person to enter. The door opened just wide enough for a tall, broad-shouldered man to slip inside. Detective Harrison closed the door quietly behind him and immediately turned the deadbolt, locking us inside the secure room. He checked the window blinds, ensuring they were pulled tightly shut before walking over to the side of my hospital bed. The stern, intimidating police persona he had worn in the ballroom and the emergency room hallway completely melted away. He let out a long, heavy sigh and ran a hand over his face, looking at me with a mixture of deep respect and genuine concern. He pulled a small plastic chair close to the mattress and sat down, resting his forearms on his knees. He told me the patrol officer outside had strict orders to arrest anyone who tried to breach the door. Harrison looked at the fresh stitches running down my arm and the dark purple bruise blooming across my cheek. He asked if the physical pain was manageable. I nodded, assuring him that the pain was nothing compared to the satisfaction of watching my family finally face the consequences of their own arrogance. He leaned closer, lowering his voice to a quiet, steady whisper. He confirmed that my parents had completely fallen into the trap by attempting to intimidate me and legally coerce me into dropping the felony assault charges right in front of the emergency room staff. They had practically handed the prosecution a textbook case of witness tampering and obstruction of justice. But we both knew the assault at the engagement party was only the superficial layer of this investigation. The physical abuse was just the violent symptom of a much larger, deeper disease rotting inside my family. I reached into the hidden side pocket of my medical bag and pulled out a small, black, encrypted flash drive. I held the cold metal device in my palm for a brief moment, feeling the immense weight of the data stored inside it. This tiny drive contained the absolute destruction of Reginald and Valerie. I extended my hand and dropped the flash drive directly into Detective Harrison's waiting palm. He closed his fingers around it, his dark eyes locking onto mine. I told him the decryption key was the exact same sequence we had established during our very first secure meeting. He placed the drive carefully into his inner jacket pocket, treating it like a highly explosive device. He asked me if I had managed to pull the complete unredacted transaction ledgers before my mother forced me out of the guest house. I smiled, looking directly into the detective's eyes. I told him I had been doing nothing but pulling ledgers for the entire past year. My family had spent the last 12 months treating me like a helpless invalid. They thought my wheelchair meant my brain had stopped working. They assumed that because my legs were broken, I was spending my days crying in the dark and feeling sorry for myself. But they completely forgot that I was a senior forensic auditor. They forgot that I tracked invisible money. For a living, I explained to Harrison that while Brianna was out shopping for designer clothes and my parents were hosting extravagant country club dinners, I was sitting in the guest house dismantling their entire financial network piece by piece. I mapped out every single bank account, every routing number, and every offshore shell company my father thought he had cleverly hidden from the federal government. I watched Harrison's expression harden as I laid out the absolute truth about my parents' supposedly perfect high society life. I told him that Reginald and Valerie were completely, utterly broke. The massive Atlanta estate they loved to show off was drowning in 3 separate hidden mortgages, and the bank was already preparing to initiate quiet foreclosure proceedings. The luxury imported cars they drove were all leased, and the payments were severely past due. My parents were currently drowning in millions of dollars of insurmountable debt, desperately trying to maintain the illusion of generational wealth to their elite friends. They were living on completely borrowed time and stolen credit. The pressure to keep up their flawless aesthetic had driven them to the absolute brink of total financial ruin. This impending bankruptcy was the reason they were so obsessed with Preston and his fake Boston technology fortune. They believed marrying Brianna off to a billionaire was their only remaining ticket out of the debt hole they had dug for themselves. They needed Preston's imaginary money to save their mansion and protect their social status. I explained to the detective that my parents were so blinded by their greed and their desperate need for cash that they never bothered to do a background check on the man who was about to marry their golden child. They were relying entirely on the wedding to save their fraudulent empire. But the flash drive I just handed over contained the final puzzle pieces connecting their bankruptcy to a much darker and sinister crime. I watched Detective Harrison process the magnitude of what I had just told him. He turned the small black flash drive over in his fingers. The quiet hum of the hospital monitors seemed to fade into the background as I prepared to outline the most devastating revelation of all. I told him to open the folder labeled Mount Moriah Baptist. The name of the church alone made his posture stiffen. Mount Moriah was not just a local congregation, it was one of the largest and most influential megachurches in the entire state of Georgia. It boasted a membership of over 10,000 people with millions of dollars flowing through its offering plates every single month. The community trusted the church implicitly, and the church trusted my father. Reginald had served as the head treasurer for the board of trustees for the last 7 years. He was the man who led the closing prayers on Sunday mornings while wearing a pristine tailored suit. He projected an image of absolute moral authority and unimpeachable financial wisdom. But that was just another carefully constructed illusion. I explained to the detective that an engagement party with imported caviar and a $500,000 wedding reception did not just magically pay for itself, especially when my parents were secretly drowning in foreclosure notices. They needed a massive injection of untraceable cash to pull off this grand society wedding. So my father decided to simply take it from the very people who trusted him the most. I detailed exactly how. Reginald had spent the last 8 months systematically siphoning money out of the church building fund and the community outreach program. He set up a series of shadow accounts masked as legitimate community vendors. When the church board thought they were approving payments for youth center renovations and charity food drives, they were actually funding Brianna's custom imported silk wedding dress and my mother's extravagant country club lifestyle. The sheer audacity of his theft was completely staggering. He truly believed he was entirely untouchable. I told Harrison how I had followed the digital paper trail. My father was arrogant enough to believe that his high standing in the community made him completely immune to an audit. He used a crude invoicing scheme that any competent forensic accountant could easily unravel within an hour. He fabricated invoices from non-existent event planning companies and routed the church funds directly into a private offshore holding account. From there, the stolen money was quietly funneled back into my parents' personal checking accounts disguised as consulting fees. That was how they managed to put down a massive, non-refundable cash deposit on the historic mansion for the engagement party. They were literally drinking champagne paid for by the hard-earned tithes of working-class families who genuinely believed they were giving to a higher cause. My parents felt no guilt drinking that stolen wine. Detective Harrison leaned back in his plastic chair. He let out a slow, heavy breath. His eyes locked onto mine, searching for any trace of hesitation or regret. He knew the church board members personally. He understood exactly what kind of explosive scandal this would cause within the Atlanta community. The fallout would be absolutely catastrophic, not just for my family but for the entire congregation. Harrison crossed his arms over his broad chest and lowered his voice to a grave, serious whisper. told me that the evidence on this flash drive crossed a massive legal line. We were no longer just talking about a local domestic assault charge or a petty civil dispute over a ruined engagement party. Embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from a registered nonprofit organization involved federal wire fraud and severe tax evasion. The scope of this crime required bringing in government agents immediately. He wanted to make sure I fully understood the sheer gravity of what I was handing over to the authorities. Harrison warned me that once he submitted this digital evidence to the Financial Crimes Division, the local police would immediately notify the federal authorities. There would be absolutely no way to stop the momentum of the investigation once it started. The entire family legacy would be utterly destroyed beyond repair. He told me that if I agreed to officially testify in court to verify the WASI's financial routing numbers, my parents would not just face public embarrassment, they would be facing significant mandatory time in a federal prison. He leaned in closer and asked me if I was truly prepared to be the one who put my own mother and father behind bars for a very long time. He wanted absolute certainty before he made the final call to initiate the formal process. I did not look away from him. I did not blink or show any weakness. I thought about the searing pain in my spine from the car crash I took the blame for. I thought about the 6 agonizing months I spent learning how to navigate the world in a wheelchair, while my parents completely ignored my suffering to plan a wedding. I remembered the harsh sting of my father's heavy hand slapping across my face while I lay bleeding on the cold marble floor tonight. I remembered my mother telling me I was a worthless burden who was ruining their perfect aesthetic. They had sacrificed my body, my freedom, and my peace of mind just to maintain their toxic, superficial empire. They felt no remorse for stealing from their dedicated community, and they felt absolutely no remorse for destroying my life. Their greed had consumed every single shred of their humanity. The little girl who desperately wanted their love had died a long time ago. She died the night they pulled Brianna from the driver's seat of that wrecked car and left me to take the fall. The woman sitting in this hospital bed felt nothing but a demand for absolute justice. I looked Detective Harrison directly in his eyes. My voice did not shake or waver. In the slightest, I told him I had already mentally prepared myself for this exact outcome. Many months ago, I did not care about their fake legacy or their stolen mansion. I only cared about ensuring they could never manipulate or destroy another person again. I took a slow, deep breath and told him to draft the subpoena. The morning after my secret meeting with Detective Harrison, the hospital finally cleared me for discharge. I refused to return to my parents' estate and opted for a discreet boutique hotel located in the heart of downtown Atlanta. The silence of my hotel room was a welcome relief from the constant buzzing of medical monitors, but I needed a change of scenery to finalize my strategy. I wheeled myself down the street to a quiet upscale coffee shop. It was a crisp morning and the cafe was mostly empty, save for a few business professionals typing away on their laptops. I ordered a black coffee and positioned my wheelchair at a small table near the back exit, giving me a clear view of the front door. I pulled my secure laptop from my bag and began organizing the final pieces of digital evidence. The quiet atmosphere was exactly what I needed to focus my mind. But the peace did not last long. The heavy glass door of the cafe swung open and Preston marched inside. He was not wearing his usual tailored suit today. He wore a dark hoodie and sunglasses, looking frantic and out of place in the elegant establishment. He scanned the room, his eyes darting back and forth until they locked onto my wheelchair. A nasty scowl formed on his face as he closed the distance between us in a few aggressive strides. He did not say hello or pretend to be the charming future brother-in-law. Preston grabbed the chair opposite my table and violently dragged it, scraping the metal legs against the polished hardwood floor. He slammed his body into the seat and leaned over the small wooden table, invading my personal space. I could smell stale alcohol and nervous sweat radiating off his clothes. He looked nothing like the polished billionaire heir my parents were desperate to impress. He looked like a desperate rat backed into a dangerous corner. Preston slammed a crumpled piece of paper onto the table right over my keyboard. It was the same legal waiver he had tried to force me to sign in the emergency room. He leaned his face close to mine, telling me in a low, vicious whisper that I was going to sign over my $2 million insurance payout. Right this second. His voice was stripped of that fake Boston accent he used around my mother. He sounded rough and unhinged. He threatened that if I did not transfer the funds into his holding company by noon, he would make sure my remaining good leg was permanently broken. He sneered at me, mocking my wheelchair and telling me that nobody in my family cared about me anyway. He said my parents gave him permission to handle me however he saw fit because they were desperate to get rid of me. He thought his physical presence and violent threats would force me into immediate submission. He assumed I was a weak, disabled woman, sitting alone in a coffee shop, defenseless against a strong, angry man. I did not reach for the panic button on my phone. I did not flinch or lean away from his aggressive posture. I simply picked up my coffee cup and took a slow, deliberate sip, maintaining intense, unblinking eye contact with him. I placed the cup down and gently pushed his crumpled legal waiver off the edge of the table, letting it flutter into the trash can beside my wheel. Preston turned bright red with fury, opening his mouth to yell, but I raised a single finger to silence him. I reached into the hidden compartment of my bag and pulled out a thick manila folder. I set it down on the table and rested my hand on top of it. I told him he needed to sit back and lower his voice before he embarrassed himself further. I advised him to take a deep breath, because the fantasy world he built around my gullible parents was about to come crashing down right here in this coffee shop. I slid the manila folder slowly across the table until it touched his hands. I told him to open it. Preston let out a dismissive scoff, acting tough, but his hands were trembling as he flipped open the cardboard cover. The very first photograph inside the folder was a high-resolution satellite image of a dilapidated rusted trailer park in rural Ohio. The second photograph was a close-up of a rundown mobile home with a collapsing roof and a yard full of garbage. I watched his eyes widen in absolute horror as he stared at the images of his actual childhood home. I leaned forward and told him I knew exactly who he was. I knew his real name was not Preston, and I knew his family did not own a technology empire in Boston. I told him. I traced his supposed trust fund back to a string of empty shell companies, currently under investigation for wire fraud. I watched the arrogant smirk vanish from his pale, sweating face. But the trailer park photos were just the warm-up. I told him to turn to the third page. Preston swallowed hard and flipped the paper, revealing a printed ledger of offshore bank transfers. I watched him physically recoil as he recognized the account numbers. I explained that as a senior forensic auditor, tracking dirty money was my specialty. I knew he was currently drowning in over $1 million of debt to a highly dangerous underground syndicate. I knew those violent men were actively looking for him, and I knew he was only marrying my sister to steal my insurance money through my parents to pay off his loan sharks. He was absolutely terrified. He tried to speak, but his voice completely failed him. He sat there frozen, staring at the undeniable proof of his entire fraudulent existence. I closed the folder and pulled it back toward me. I told him that I had already sent copies of these documents to a secure server. I whispered that if he ever came near me again, or if he ever threatened me, I would personally forward his exact location to the men he owed money to. I advised him to think very carefully about his next move, because his fake billionaire persona was completely dead. I unlocked the brakes on my wheelchair and smoothly backed away from the table. I left him sitting there, sweating and terrified, completely paralyzed by the realization that the disabled woman he thought he could easily bully was actually the one holding his entire life in her hands. The drive to my parents' massive estate felt different this time. I was no longer a frightened daughter. I was a predator walking willingly into a cage, knowing I held the only key. My parents summoned me to the main house for a final mediation. In reality, it was an execution of my financial independence. I wheeled through the mahogany doors and navigated toward the dining room. The space was extravagant, filled with crystal and antique furniture. Reginald sat at the head of the polished table. Valerie stood behind him with her arms crossed tightly. Brianna sat to his right, swirling sparkling water with a smug smile plastered across her face. They looked like a tribunal waiting to pass judgment. Preston was noticeably absent. I knew exactly why he was not there to face me. The photographs of his trailer park and loan shark debts had paralyzed him with fear. But my family remained completely oblivious to his true identity. They still believed they were securing a billionaire legacy. Reginald did not ask how my fresh stitches were healing. He slid a heavy stack of legal documents across the table. The papers stopped right in front of my wheelchair. He stated my rebellion had caused enough embarrassment for 1 week. He demanded I sign over the entire $2 million insurance payout from my car accident directly into Preston's startup holding company. My father claimed this massive financial contribution would serve as my formal apology for destroying the Champagne Tower and ruining Brianna's engagement party. He promised if I signed the money away, they would graciously allow me to move back into the guest house and resume funding my physical therapy. I looked down at the documents, taking a slow and carefully measured breath. It was time to deliver the performance of a lifetime. I let my shoulders slump forward intentionally, collapsing my posture to make myself look incredibly small and entirely defeated. I lowered my chin and allowed my voice to tremble just enough to sound thoroughly broken. I told them that I was so tired of fighting. I whispered that I just wanted things to go back to normal, and that I did not want to lose my family completely. I looked up at my mother with wide, fearful eyes, pretending that her cruel eviction tactic had successfully crushed my spirit. Valerie let out a long, dramatic sigh of pure relief. She walked over and gently patted the top of my head, as if I were a disobedient dog that had finally learned how to follow basic commands. She told me that this was the smartest decision I had ever made. She said that once the money was safely transferred into Preston's accounts, we could put this entire ugly incident behind us. Brianna leaned across the table, her eyes gleaming with absolute malicious joy. She could not resist the opportunity to kick me while she thought I was completely down. She smiled, showing all her perfectly white teeth, and told me I was finally acting like a good, obedient cripple. The sheer toxicity of her words hung heavily in the quiet dining room. My parents did not correct her or reprimand her for the vile insult. They simply nodded together in silent agreement, completely validating her cruelty. I kept my expression perfectly submissive, pushing down the intense wave of anger that threatened to break my carefully constructed facade. I told them that the insurance money was locked in a highly secure digital trust, and that physical signatures would not be enough to authorize the immediate release of the funds. I explained that I needed to execute a direct wire transfer through my encrypted accounting portal to bypass the standard banking delays. Reginald looked slightly suspicious for a brief moment, but his overwhelming greed quickly washed away any lingering doubts. He aggressively gestured for me to open my laptop and get it done now. I pulled my heavy silver laptop from my bag and set it on the dining table. I popped open the screen and rapidly typed in my biometric passwords. The familiar glow of the financial portal illuminated my face. My family watched me with hungry, desperate eyes like starving animals waiting for a piece of raw meat. They thought they had completely won. They believed their psychological manipulation and financial abuse had successfully broken my will. I opened the transfer window and typed in the exact amount of $2 million. Then I moved to the routing section. I did not type in the account numbers for Preston's fake holding company. Instead, I entered a very specific, heavily encrypted routing sequence that Detective Harrison had personally handed to me during our secret meeting at the hospital. It was a highly classified federal honeypot account directly controlled and monitored by the Internal Revenue Service and the Financial Crimes Division. By forcing me to wire massive sums of money to cover their extortion and embezzlement, my family was unknowingly linking their personal IP addresses and financial signatures directly to a federal sting operation. The moment this money moved, every piece of their corrupt empire would be instantly flagged, seized, and locked down by government agents. I kept my hands perfectly steady as I hovered the cursor over the final confirmation button. I looked up at my family one last time. They were smiling at each other, completely intoxicated by their perceived victory and their absolute power over my life. I pressed the enter key with a soft, quiet click. The screen flashed bright green, indicating the massive wire transfer was officially complete and irreversible. I slowly turned the laptop around so Reginald could clearly see the bright green digital confirmation screen. My father let out a loud, triumphant laugh, completely praising his own brilliant negotiation skills. Valerie clapped her hands together loudly, celebrating the fact that Brianna's high society wedding was now fully funded and entirely secure. Brianna smirked at me, telling me I could finally roll myself right back to the guest house where I belonged. I silently closed my laptop and locked my wheelchair brakes, preparing to leave the dining room. They were so busy gloating and celebrating their incredible wealth that they had absolutely no idea they had just handed the federal government the exact weapon needed to lock them all in prison for the rest of their miserable lives. The days following that dining room meeting moved forward with deceptive speed. The parents were consumed by wedding preparations, acting as if the $2 million transfer had erased all their mounting debts and impending legal disasters. They strutted around the massive estate, projecting an image of invincibility to their wealthy friends. Meanwhile, I retreated to the guest house, playing the broken, compliant daughter to perfection. I needed them to feel secure in their false victory. The trap was set, and federal authorities were tracking every digital movement of the stolen funds. Before the grand finale at the altar, there was one more event that required my attention. Brianna hosted her extravagant bridal shower on a sunny Tuesday afternoon at an exclusive country club in Buckhead. The sprawling outdoor patio was decorated with white roses and imported silk drapery. Over 50 of Atlanta's influential society women attended, wearing designer dresses and oversized sun hats. Waiters circulated with silver trays, offering delicate pastries and vintage champagne. It was a flawless picture of luxury, engineered to make Brianna the center of the universe. I arrived, rolling my wheelchair onto the patio with a subdued expression. My mother Valerie spotted me and rushed over, grabbing the handles of my chair to park me near the back. She leaned down and whispered a harsh warning, telling me to stay completely silent and not ruin her golden child's afternoon. I simply nodded, keeping my eyes lowered and my hands folded neatly in my lap. I watched Brianna glide through the crowd, soaking up compliments and bragging loudly about her successful billionaire fiancé. She told everyone Preston was currently tied up with technology investors at an exclusive downtown hotel, finalizing a massive corporate merger before the wedding day. The afternoon progressed until it was time for the gift opening ceremony. Brianna took her seat on an ornate velvet throne placed directly at the center of the patio. A massive pile of beautifully wrapped boxes surrounded her. The high society guests gathered around, forming a tight circle of eager spectators. Brianna opened each gift, making sure to loudly announce the brand names and the obvious expense of every item. There were crystal vases, silk robes, and diamond tennis bracelets. She played the overwhelmed bride to perfection, soaking in the envious stares of her friends. After opening the expensive gifts, Brianna reached for a simple box wrapped in basic silver paper. It was the gift I had brought. I knew exactly why she chose to open it last. She wanted to use my gift as a cruel public punchline. She wanted to highlight the vast difference between her glamorous life and my pathetic disabled existence. She held the silver box up for the entire crowd to see, pasting a fake sympathetic smile across her face. She announced that this gift was from her disabled older sister, Sydney, who had been struggling financially lately. Brianna claimed it was incredibly sweet of me to scrape together my limited funds to buy her a present. The ladies in the crowd let out sighs of pity, giving me condescending smiles. I kept my face blank, watching as Brianna tore away the wrapping paper. She opened the lid, expecting to find some cheap piece of jewelry she could quietly mock. Instead, she pulled out a heavy wooden picture frame. Her fake smile froze instantly as her eyes locked onto the image displayed behind the glass. The patio grew incredibly quiet as the women closest to the throne leaned in, trying to see what had caused the bride's face to turn chalky white. Inside the frame was a perfectly clear printed screenshot of a highly active dating profile. It was Preston's, grinning, face smiling arrogantly at the camera. The profile biography bragged about being a single successful entrepreneur looking for casual fun in Atlanta. But the most devastating detail was the bold green text flashing near the bottom of the screen. The dating application indicated that this user was currently active and geolocated exactly 2 miles away at a cheap roadside motel, not in a corporate merger meeting at an exclusive downtown hotel. The timestamp on the screenshot showed it had been captured less than 48 hours ago. Brianna let out a piercing scream of pure horror. She dropped the wooden frame as if it had burned her manicured hands. The glass shattered against the stone patio, creating a sharp cracking sound that echoed across the country club. The high society women gasped in shock, suddenly realizing exactly what they were looking at. Whispers erupted instantly, sweeping through the crowd of wealthy guests like an uncontrolled wildfire. They pointed at the shattered frame and muttered to each other, their eyes darting between the humiliated crying bride and the broken evidence of her fiancé, blatant infidelity. Valerie rushed forward, pushing through the crowd of gossiping women. She looked down at the shattered frame and let out a strangled gasp of panic. She desperately tried to kick the broken pieces under the velvet throne, but it was far too late. The damage was already completely done. Brianna stood up, her chest heaving with manic, rapid breaths. She glared across the patio, her eyes locking directly onto me with an intense, murderous fury. She screamed at me, demanding to know what kind of sick, twisted joke I was playing. She loudly accused me of forging the image to ruin her perfect life out of spite and bitter jealousy. I did not flinch. Even for a single second, I slowly unlocked the heavy manual brakes on my wheelchair and looked directly into my younger sister's panicked and enraged eyes. I told her in a perfectly calm, clear, and completely steady voice that digital footprints do not ever lie under any circumstances. I strongly advised her to call her wealthy billionaire fiancé right now and ask him exactly how his technology merger was going at the discount motel located just down the street. The entire sunlit patio fell completely silent, hanging desperately onto my every single word. I turned my wheelchair around and smoothly navigated away from the large, stunned gathering, leaving Brianna sobbing uncontrollably on her ornate velvet throne, while all her high society friends ruthlessly recorded her public humiliation on their smartphones. This was just a minor preview of the total absolute devastation waiting for them at the altar. The sun set on the disastrous bridal shower, but the chaos inside my parents' estate was only beginning. The pristine image they spent decades cultivating was cracked wide open in front of Atlanta's most influential gossips. Brianna locked herself inside her bedroom, refusing to speak to anyone, while Valerie paced the floors, calling her socialite friends to spin damage control lies. She told everyone the dating profile was a deep fake created by a jealous ex-girlfriend. She insisted Preston was a devoted billionaire busy saving the economy. But beneath her loud, frantic voice, I heard the distinct tremor of panic. She knew the high society women were not buying her excuses. They were already smelling fresh blood in the water. While my mother tried to salvage their social standing, my father faced a much more dangerous reality in his private home office. Reginald spent 8 months treating the Mount Moriah Baptist Church building fund like his own personal piggy bank, assuming his position as head treasurer made him untouchable. He believed his tailored suits shielded him from scrutiny. But rumors from the country club spread incredibly fast. Some church board members had wives who attended the bridal shower. They saw the spectacular public humiliation and started asking uncomfortable questions about how my father was funding this $500,000 wedding festival. I sat quietly in the dark guest house watching my encrypted laptop screen illuminate the room. I tapped into the estate's internal network, allowing me to monitor the digital traffic passing through my father's private office router. Just after 9 o'clock that evening, a highly urgent email popped onto Reginald's screen. It was marked with top priority from the senior pastor and the unified board of trustees. They demanded an emergency independent audit of the church financial records starting the very next morning at 8 o'clock sharp. They cited concerning discrepancies in recent vendor invoices and requested all physical ledgers be surrendered immediately for a comprehensive review. I could almost hear my father's heart completely stop beating from across the manicured lawn. His fraudulent empire was collapsing right on top of him. If the independent auditors looked at the church bank accounts tomorrow morning, they would instantly see hundreds of thousands of dollars were entirely missing. They would find the fake invoices he used to pay for Brianna's imported silk dress and the extravagant mansion deposit. He needed to replace that stolen money tonight before the sun came up, or he would face federal wire fraud charges by tomorrow afternoon. He was trapped in a corner with nowhere to run. I watched the network activity spike as Reginald frantically dialed his future son-in-law. My father was sweating and desperate, abandoning his authoritative tone. He practically begged Preston to temporarily wire back a portion of the $2 million insurance payout. I supposedly surrendered earlier that week. Reginald lied, claiming he needed to show liquid proof of funds for a sudden real estate investment opportunity. He promised Preston he would wire the money right back immediately after the wedding ceremony finished. He pleaded with the fake billionaire to save him from this temporary cash flow problem. Preston sat alone in his cheap roadside motel room, nursing a severe hangover and a mounting sense of dread. He was not a wealthy Boston technology heir. He was a broke con artist who owed a violent underground syndicate over $1 million. Those dangerous men gave him a strict deadline to pay his debts, and that deadline was rapidly approaching. Preston banked entirely on stealing my insurance money to save his own life. When Reginald called demanding cash, Preston panicked. He realized if my father went down for financial crimes, the entire wedding charade would completely implode, leaving him with nothing. Preston tried playing it cool, using his best fake, arrogant voice to reassure my father. He told Reginald it was a minor inconvenience, but he would happily transfer $500,000 to help out the family business. He claimed his massive holding company moved millions every single day, so this small favor was no problem for him. Reginald let out a loud, sobbing breath of relief, thanking his future son-in-law profusely. My father hung up the phone, genuinely believing he successfully dodged a massive federal prison sentence. He thought his clever manipulation saved his pristine reputation right at the very last second. I leaned closer to my laptop screen, monitoring Preston's exact digital movements. The con artist frantically opened his web browser and navigated to the offshore holding account, where he thought my $2 million insurance payout was resting. He typed in his complex passwords with trembling fingers, desperately hoping to wire the cash to Reginald and keep his elaborate scam alive just a little bit longer. His loan sharks were breathing down his neck, and his future father-in-law was begging for a bailout. Preston sweated profusely, praying the massive balance would load on his screen. He clicked the final login button, expecting to see a beautiful seven-figure balance waiting for him. But the screen did not display a banking ledger. It did not show a menu of transfer options or a welcome message from his offshore financial institution. Instead, the entire browser window flashed a blinding, stark white. The screen was completely locked. A massive, bold red error message appeared directly in the center of his monitor, blocking him from clicking anywhere else on the page. The stark, terrifying words were written in heavy block letters that practically screamed at him through the glowing digital display. The message read, "Assets seized by Federal Bureau of Investigation. This account and all associated funds have been frozen under suspicion of wire fraud and federal embezzlement. All access is permanently revoked." Preston stared at the glowing red letters, feeling the blood completely drain from his face. His lungs seized up, refusing to take in any oxygen. He mashed his fingers against the keyboard, frantically refreshing the page over and over again, hoping it was just a terrible digital glitch, but the terrifying federal seizure notice remained permanently burned into the screen. The $2 million he thought he successfully stolen from the disabled sister was completely gone, and the United States government was actively tracking his exact location. The trap I carefully built around them was now tightly shut, snapping their bones into pieces. The night before the wedding blanketed the sprawling Atlanta estate in a suffocating layer of invisible tension. I sat in the quiet darkness of the guest house, monitoring the frantic digital network activity radiating from the main house. The massive federal seizure of the offshore accounts had thrown my entire family into an absolute state of unmitigated panic. My laptop screen displayed a continuous stream of desperate encrypted searches originating from my father's private office. Reginald was frantically trying to access back channels and shadow accounts, hoping to find any remaining drops of liquidity to save his crumbling empire. He was entirely locked out of every single financial institution he had ever touched. The church audit was scheduled to begin in less than 12 hours, and my father had absolutely no way to replace the hundreds of thousands of dollars he had blatantly embezzled. Inside the main house, the atmosphere was incredibly toxic. I tapped into the internal security cameras and watched my parents pacing the grand living room like trapped animals. Reginald looked physically ill. His custom-tailored shirt was wrinkled, and his face was slick with a cold, nervous sweat. He kept dialing his cell phone, desperately trying to reach his future son-in-law to confirm the wire transfer had been initiated. Valerie was pacing in tight, rapid circles, clutching a glass of wine. Her perfectly manicured appearance was finally starting to crack under the immense weight of their impending financial doom. She knew the catering company, the florists, and the venue managers would attempt to run the final authorization charges on their platinum credit cards by morning. Those cards were entirely frozen and useless. Despite the glaring reality of their absolute destruction, my parents made a conscious and highly calculated choice. I listened through the security audio feed as Valerie firmly instructed my father to stop panicking and focus on the immediate social strategy. She told him that canceling the $500,000 wedding mere hours before the ceremony would be social suicide in the elite Atlanta community. The embarrassment would be permanent and completely devastating to their carefully cultivated image. Valerie pragmatically pointed out that they had invited over 300 incredibly wealthy guests to the ceremony. She calculated that the monetary wedding gifts, the cash envelopes, and the high-value registry items would bring in enough immediate capital to temporarily satisfy the church auditors. They were planning to steal the wedding gifts from their own daughter to cover up my father's massive federal embezzlement. They agreed to push forward with the extravagant charade using Brianna's supposedly perfect day as a desperate shield to hide their criminal activity. Upstairs in the master guest suite, Brianna remained completely oblivious to the catastrophic financial disaster unfolding right beneath her feet. The security cameras showed her sitting in front of a massive vanity mirror, surrounded by expensive cosmetics and imported silk robes. She was obsessively practicing her flawless bridal smile, completely consumed by her own narcissism. Brianna convinced herself that the embarrassing incident at the bridal shower was just a minor hiccup that everyone would forget the moment she walked down the aisle. She firmly believed that her handsome billionaire fiancé would fix everything tomorrow and whisk her away to a life of endless luxury. She refused to look past her own vanity, making her the perfect pawn in my parents' desperate scheme. Miles away from the manicured lawns of the estate, Preston was experiencing his own terrifying reality inside a cheap roadside motel room. My network monitors showed his digital footprint bouncing frantically across various dark web servers as he desperately tried to find a way around the federal seizure notice, blocking his offshore accounts. The massive warning screen from the Federal Bureau of Investigation remained permanently burned into his monitor. The $2 million he needed to save his life was completely untouchable. Preston knew the dangerous underground syndicate he owed money to would not accept any more excuses or delays. He began throwing his few belongings into a battered duffel bag, preparing to flee the city and disappear into the night. His survival instincts were finally kicking in, urging him to run as far away from Atlanta as possible before the loan sharks found him. I sat in my wheelchair staring at the glowing data on my screen. I needed Preston to stay exactly where he was. The trap I had spent a year building required all the guilty parties to be present at the altar tomorrow morning. If the fake billionaire ran away into the night, the spectacular public reckoning I had carefully orchestrated would be incomplete. I needed to manipulate his overwhelming greed and push him over the edge of reason. I picked up my untraceable encrypted mobile device, and typed out a very short and incredibly simple text message. I sent it directly to Preston's personal cell phone number. The message simply told him to run away while he still could. It was the perfect psychological bait. I watched his digital activity pause the exact moment the text message was delivered. Preston was a career con artist built entirely on arrogant confidence and a desperate need to win. Receiving a threatening message from the disabled sister he thought he had completely defeated triggered his massive ego. He stopped packing his duffel bag. In his twisted, desperate mind, my text message was not a genuine warning. He interpreted it as a sign of weakness. He assumed I was trying to scare him away because I was terrified he was going to successfully marry into my family and take everything. He calculated that if he just pushed through the ceremony tomorrow, he would become a legal member of the family. He believed that as Brianna's husband, he could manipulate Reginald into selling the massive estate to access new hidden funds. Preston slowly unpacked his bag and laid his rented tuxedo across the motel bed. His insatiable greed blinded him to the federal trap waiting for him. He chose to ignore the blaring alarms and walk directly into his own destruction. I powered down my laptop and turned my wheelchair toward the window. Tomorrow morning, the bright sun would rise on a beautiful, extravagant wedding, and I was going to ensure that every single one of them paid for their cruelty. The bright morning sun streamed through the massive stained glass windows of the largest megachurch in Atlanta, Georgia. The sanctuary was absolutely breathtaking, transformed into a lavish floral wonderland that must have cost an absolute fortune. Thousands of imported white orchids cascaded down the wooden pews, creating a fragrant pathway fit for royalty. The high society elite of the city filled the seats, wearing designer suits and expensive silk dresses. They murmured in hushed, respectful tones, unaware that the beautiful floral arrangements surrounding them were paid for with stolen money. I navigated my wheelchair through the heavy wooden doors and positioned myself quietly in the back row of the sanctuary. I wore a simple dark dress, blending perfectly into the shadows near the rear exit. I did not want to draw attention to myself yet. I simply wanted to observe the final moments of my family's fraudulent empire before the entire structure collapsed onto their heads. My father, Reginald, stood near the front of the church, greeting the wealthiest guests with a booming, arrogant laugh. His custom tuxedo fit him perfectly, hiding the fact that he was a desperate criminal on the verge of federal indictment. He looked smug, completely convinced he had successfully avoided a massive prison sentence. He truly believed the wire transfer from the night before had secured his reputation and covered his massive embezzlement tracks. He patted his friends on the back and shook hands with the church board members he had been stealing from for the past 8 months. My mother, Valerie, floated through the center aisle, playing the role of the perfect, wealthy matriarch. She hugged the wives of prominent politicians and local celebrities, soaking up their envious compliments about the extravagant wedding decor. She looked radiant, blind to the devastation waiting for her at the altar. The pipe organ began to play a majestic melody, signaling the official start of the ceremony. The heavy chatter in the sanctuary faded into a respectful silence as the guests took their seats. I looked down the long center aisle and fixed my eyes on Preston. He stood at the altar, waiting for his bride. He was wearing a rented tuxedo that looked completely out of place next to the luxurious floral displays. What struck me most was his physical demeanor. Preston was sweating profusely. His face was pale, and he kept shifting his weight from side to side, looking nervously toward the side exit doors. He knew the Federal Bureau of Investigation had seized the offshore accounts. He knew his violent loan sharks were actively hunting him down right at this very moment. He was completely terrified, but his insatiable greed kept his feet glued to the altar. He foolishly believed that if he could just get a wedding ring on my sister's finger, he could still manipulate my father into selling the mansion to pay off his debts. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the church swung open, revealing my sister Brianna. She stood perfectly framed in the bright morning light, wearing a breathtaking custom silk gown that cost $15,000. A long, sheer veil covered her face, hiding the incredible vanity and arrogance in her eyes. She looked like a flawless, beautiful princess, stepping straight out of a fairy tale. The entire congregation stood up, turning their heads to admire the gorgeous bride. The organ music swelled, reaching a triumphant crescendo. Brianna took a deep breath and prepared to take her first step down the long white aisle. But before she could move, a sudden chaotic commotion erupted near the front row. A woman carrying a thick clipboard pushed her way aggressively past the standing guests. It was the head wedding planner, and she looked frantic. She completely ignored the solemn atmosphere of the church and marched directly up to my mother. Valerie looked shocked and deeply annoyed by the sudden interruption. She grabbed the wedding planner's arm and tried to forcefully pull her into the side aisle away from the staring guests, but the planner refused to move. I watched from my wheelchair at the back of the room as the woman leaned in and began whispering furiously into my mother's ear. Even from a distance, I could see the exact moment the color completely drained from Valerie's face. The wedding planner was shaking her head and pointing aggressively at her clipboard. She informed my mother that the luxury catering company, the floral designers, and the estate reception managers had just attempted to run the final authorization charges on the family credit cards. The planner stated loudly enough for the surrounding wealthy guests to hear that every single piece of plastic had been immediately declined by the central bank. The planner explained that the bank's fraud department had locked the accounts, and the reception vendors were threatening to pack up all the food and leave the estate if they did not receive an immediate wire transfer for the remaining $200,000. Valerie stumbled backward, her hand flying up to cover her mouth. Several high society women sitting in the second row turned their heads, whispering frantically to their husbands as they witnessed the embarrassing financial dispute unfolding in the middle of the sacred ceremony. My mother looked like she was going to faint. Her perfectly constructed illusion of limitless wealth was cracking in front of the exact people she spent her entire life trying to impress. She looked desperately toward Reginald, but my father was completely frozen, staring at the wedding planner in absolute horror. Valerie refused to accept reality. She could not bear canceling the ceremony and facing the social humiliation of admitting they were broke. She grabbed the wedding planner and hissed at her to stall the angry vendors. My mother promised she would resolve the error the second the ceremony finished. She desperately believed Preston would hand over his billions the moment he became her son-in-law. Valerie forced a strained smile and signaled the organist to play the bridal march louder. She turned back to face the altar, pretending nothing was wrong. Brianna, oblivious to the financial disaster, finally began her slow, triumphant walk down the aisle. I sat perfectly still in my wheelchair, watching my family stubbornly march forward into their own destruction. They forced the ceremony to continue, completely unaware the real catastrophe was waiting to be unleashed. Valerie managed to push the frantic wedding planner into the side aisle, forcing a strained smile onto her face as she turned back to the altar. She gave a sharp nod to the organist, demanding the music swell louder to drown out any lingering whispers. Brianna remained completely oblivious to the financial disaster unfolding just feet away. She continued her dramatic march down the white aisle, bathing in the envious stares of the wealthy congregation. She reached the altar and handed her bouquet to her maid of honor, turning to face the man she believed was her billionaire savior. Preston offered her a trembling smile, his pale face shining with cold sweat under the bright church lights. The senior pastor stepped up to the wooden podium, adjusting his microphone and opening his gold-embossed Bible to begin the formal ceremony. The sanctuary grew incredibly quiet as the pastor began speaking in his deep, resonant voice. He delivered a passionate sermon about the sanctity of marriage, emphasizing the absolute importance of honesty, integrity, and unbreakable trust between a husband and a wife. Every single word he spoke felt completely absurd, given the massive web of lies standing directly in front of him. Reginald stood in the front row, puffing out his chest and attempting to look like a proud, wealthy patriarch. He kept glancing nervously at his replica watch, counting down the minutes until he could corner Preston and demand the wire transfer to cover his federal embezzlement. Valerie stood beside him, clutching a lace handkerchief, fighting off a full-blown panic attack over her declined platinum credit cards. I sat perfectly still in my wheelchair at the back of the church, watching the hypocritical spectacle unfold. I reached my hand into the pocket of my dark dress, and my fingers closed tightly around a small black remote control. This remote was directly linked to the massive dual projector screens mounted high above the choir loft on either side of the altar. These screens were currently displaying a beautifully edited slideshow of Brianna and Preston, pretending to be a flawless high society couple, smiling on yachts and posing at exclusive country clubs. The pastor finished his opening remarks and moved into the traditional vows. He asked the congregation to bow their heads in a silent prayer before asking the final binding question. The massive room was completely silent for a long, heavy moment. The pastor raised his head and looked out over the sea of wealthy guests. He took a slow breath and spoke the words I had been waiting an entire year to hear. He asked if anyone present had any lawful reason why this man and this woman should not be joined in holy matrimony, to speak now or forever hold their peace. He paused, expecting the traditional respectful silence to follow. Brianna giggled softly, looking up at Preston with absolute adoration. Reginald shifted his weight, ready for the ceremony to conclude. But before the pastor could continue to the exchange of rings, I raised my hand high into the air and pushed my wheelchair out of the dark shadows into the center aisle. I spoke in a loud, clear, and perfectly steady voice that echoed off the high vaulted ceilings of the sanctuary. I stated that I had a very serious objection to this union. Hundreds of heads whipped around instantly, staring at the disabled sister they had previously ignored. Brianna gasped out loud, her perfect smile vanishing as she saw me rolling forward. Valerie let out a strangled shriek of horror, stepping out of the front pew to demand I remain silent. Reginald turned bright purple with fury, clenching his fists and marching toward the center aisle to stop me. I did not let them intimidate me. I stopped my wheelchair halfway down the aisle and firmly pressed the main button on my remote control. The romantic slideshow playing on the massive projector screens above the altar instantly vanished. The soft instrumental music playing in the background cut out completely, replaced by the harsh electronic click of a new display loading. High above the heads of the terrified bride and groom, the screens flashed bright white before displaying a highly classified Internal Revenue Service audit dashboard. The massive digital screens showed a real-time map of offshore banking transfers linking directly back to the very church we were standing inside. The dashboard displayed bold red alerts indicating active federal investigations into wire fraud and severe financial embezzlement. The wealthy congregation gasped in collective shock as they stared up at the undeniable federal evidence projecting right in front of their faces. I looked directly at the senior pastor and delivered my final devastating blow. I told the entire church that I strongly objected because my younger sister was currently trying to marry a fugitive con artist. I announced loudly that the fake billionaire standing at the altar was actively using $500,000 stolen directly from this exact church's community orphanage fund to pay for this lavish wedding ceremony. I pointed my finger right at Reginald and revealed that my father, the trusted church treasurer, had systematically embezzled the donation money to fund his golden child's luxurious lifestyle and hide his own impending bankruptcy. Utter chaos erupted instantly throughout the massive sanctuary. The prominent church board members sitting in the first few rows jumped to their feet in absolute outrage, yelling and pointing at the projected financial records displayed above the altar. High society women screamed and clutched their pearls as the reality of the stolen money washed over the crowd. Reginald stumbled backward, clutching his chest as the board members began advancing toward him, demanding immediate answers. Valerie collapsed into the wooden pew, sobbing hysterically as her flawless reputation shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. At the altar, Preston completely panicked. He realized his entire fake identity was thoroughly exposed, and the federal authorities were actively tracking the stolen funds. He dropped Brianna's hands roughly and spun around, scanning the sanctuary for a clear path to the side exit doors, leaving his crying bride completely alone. The furious murmurs of the betrayed congregation echoed loudly, bouncing off the stone walls and drowning out the soft weeping of my younger sister. Brianna stood frozen in her expensive ruined dress, finally realizing her fairy tale ending was actually just a meticulously engineered nightmare. The sanctuary of the megachurch erupted into an absolute frenzy of shouting and confusion. The wealthy guests, who had been weeping tears of joy just moments before, were now standing on the church pews, pointing at the massive screens projecting the undeniable federal evidence of my father's embezzlement. The prominent church board members did not hesitate for a single second. They immediately began advancing down the center aisle toward the altar, demanding that Reginald explain exactly where their community orphanage funds had gone. My father took a frantic step backward, nearly tripping over the edge of the elevated stage. He threw his hands into the air and began shouting at the top of his lungs, desperately trying to regain control over the furious congregation. Reginald pointed a trembling finger directly at me, screaming that the financial documents on the screen were completely fabricated by a bitter mind. He yelled that I was a lying, jealous psycho who had spent the entire year plotting to destroy my younger sister's happiness because I was deeply insecure about my accident. Valerie joined his frantic defense instantly. My mother hitched up her expensive designer dress and ran toward the center aisle, tears streaming down her face, ruining her flawless makeup. She sobbed loudly, begging the high society guests not to listen to a single word I said. Valerie cried out that my spinal injury had severely damaged my mental health, leaving me completely delusional and dangerous to be around. She spun the narrative with desperate practiced ease, trying to convince the angry crowd that I had hired internet hackers to create a fake federal dashboard simply because no wealthy man would ever want to marry a paralyzed woman. Brianna remained frozen at the altar, clutching her bouquet of white orchids, as her perfect fairy tale crumbled into dust in front of the entire city. Preston did not care about my parents' desperate lies or Brianna's shattered dreams. His eyes were locked entirely on the small black remote control resting firmly in the palm of my right hand. He knew that as long as those massive projector screens displayed his offshore banking accounts and his direct ties to the criminal syndicate, his chances of escaping the city alive were rapidly dropping to zero. He needed to shut down the presentation and destroy the digital evidence before the local authorities could arrive and lock him away. Preston abandoned his fake, refined posture completely. The polished billionaire persona melted away in an instant, revealing the violent, desperate con artist hiding underneath the rented tuxedo. He let out a loud string of vicious curses that echoed through the sacred space, deeply shocking the conservative church members who were watching him. He dropped all pretenses and glared at me with pure, unhinged malice. He screamed that I was a worthless, crippled problem that he should have permanently eliminated weeks ago when he had the chance. Then, without any warning, he leaped off the wooden altar and charged directly down the white aisle toward my wheelchair. He moved like a trapped wild animal, lowering his shoulder to tackle me to the ground and rip the remote control straight from my hands. The wealthy guests standing in the aisle shrieked in terror and scrambled out of his way, leaving a clear, open path between the desperate fugitive and my wheelchair. Reginald and Valerie did not make a single move to protect their injured daughter from the charging, violent man. They actually looked deeply relieved, hoping Preston would forcefully silence me and permanently turn off the damning projectors ruining their lives. I watched him sprint toward me, his face contorted with rage and his heavy hands reaching out to grab my throat. He was incredibly fast, but my mind was moving so much faster than his feet. I had played out this exact scenario in my head 1,000 times during my grueling physical therapy sessions in the dark. For the past 3 months, I had pushed my body past the absolute limits of human endurance, secretly rebuilding the shattered muscles in my legs while my family completely ignored my existence. I endured agonizing pain behind the locked doors of the guest house, teaching myself how to balance, how to walk, and how to stand perfectly tall without any assistance from anyone. I had been waiting for the absolute perfect moment to reveal my fully healed body to the heartless people who callously traded my spine for a shiny law school application. Preston was less than 10 feet away when I finally made my move. I kept my eyes locked on his furious face and smoothly reached down to my waist. I unbuckled the heavy nylon seatbelt, securing me to the chair with a quiet, sharp click. I shifted my weight forward and planted my bare feet firmly onto the cold stone floor of the center aisle. I engaged my core muscles, drawing on months of silent, relentless training and sheer willpower. Right as Preston lunged forward with his arms outstretched to violently tackle me, I pushed myself upward and stood up perfectly straight. I did not wobble, and I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I stepped gracefully to the right side, with complete fluid control completely clearing the direct path of his violent forward momentum. Preston was moving far too fast to stop his heavy body or change his direction. His eyes widened in absolute shock as he realized the wheelchair he was aiming for was now completely empty. He flew right past me, missing my physical body by mere inches. With nothing left to break his fall, Preston crashed violently headfirst into the solid oak pews lining the back of the sanctuary. The sickening sound of his body colliding with the heavy wood echoed through the church, followed immediately by his painful groan as he collapsed onto the carpeted floor in a tangled heap of ruined tuxedo fabric. The entire megachurch went completely, absolutely dead silent. No one was looking at the damning projector screens anymore. Over 300 high society guests, prominent board members, and my own toxic family members simply stared at me in total disbelief. I was standing perfectly tall in the middle of the aisle, looking down at the dangerous man groaning on the floor. I slowly turned my head and looked directly at the altar. My mother had dropped to her knees, clutching a wooden pew with her mouth hanging wide open in pure terror. My father was clutching his chest, struggling to breathe as he stared blankly at my fully functional legs. Brianna looked absolutely terrified, stepping backward until her expensive silk gown brushed against the cold altar steps. I raised my voice, ensuring every single person in the grand sanctuary could hear my final words perfectly clearly. I finished my physical therapy 3 entire months ago, I announced, projecting my voice directly toward my younger sister. I just stayed in that metal chair to see exactly how cruel you all could be when you thought I was completely helpless and broken. The heavy wooden doors at the rear entrance of the church suddenly burst open with a loud, booming crash. Detective Harrison strode into the sanctuary holding a massive federal warrant high in his hand. A highly armed tactical team of local police officers and federal agents flooded through the doors behind him, completely sealing off every single exit in the building. My younger sister told hundreds of elite guests that my paralysis was just a pathetic cry for attention before grabbing my wheelchair and launching my broken body into a $1,000 champagne tower. What my golden sister failed to notice, in her blind narcissistic rage, was the financial crimes detective standing right behind her, already dispatching a patrol unit. My name is Sydney, and I am 29 years old. Tonight was supposed to be the crown jewel of my parents' social calendar. My parents, Reginald and Valerie, had spared absolutely zero expense for this evening. The grand ballroom was transformed into a sickeningly lavish display of white silk and imported orchids. They were desperate to impress Preston and his supposedly old money-white family from Boston. My parents were obsessed with his perceived status, viewing him as the ultimate prize to secure their legacy. While Brianna was parading around the center of the room, soaking up the attention, I was stationed in a dimly lit alcove near the kitchen doors. I had been intentionally hidden behind a massive floral arrangement. A year ago, a horrific car crash had left me paralyzed from the waist down, forcing me to navigate the world in a wheelchair. I had spent months enduring agonizing physical therapy just to regain some independence. But to my family, my disability was an ugly, embarrassing flaw that needed to be swept under the rug. I sat quietly in my dark corner, nursing a glass of sparkling water and observing the room. As a senior forensic auditor, I made my living by observing the tiny details that people desperately wanted to hide. My mother, Valerie, suddenly detached herself from a group of wealthy socialites and marched directly toward my hidden alcove. Her fake, polite smile dropped the second she was out of their sight. She wore a custom designer gown that hugged her figure perfectly, but her face was twisted with pure venom. Valerie stopped right in front of my wheelchair and forcefully snatched the glass of water out of my hand, spilling some of it on my dark dress. She leaned down and hissed at me, demanding to know what I thought I was doing. I looked back at her with a completely blank expression. I told my mother I was sitting exactly where she had ordered me to sit, away from the cameras and the important guests. She snapped back, telling me not to use that tone with her. She said my wheelchair was completely ruining the aesthetic of the room, and she had specifically asked me to stay locked in the private guest suite upstairs until the main reception was completely over. My mother continued her cruel lecture, stating that Preston had very important relatives flying in from Massachusetts who came from real money. She said the last thing our family needed was for his wealthy relatives to see me sulking in a wheelchair and assume our bloodline had bad genetics. A year ago, her vicious words would have shattered my heart into a million pieces. Back then, I was still desperately trying to earn her love and prove I was just as worthy as my younger sister. But surviving a near-fatal accident strips away the illusion of family loyalty very quickly. I knew exactly why my mother favored Brianna so much. Brianna was the beautiful, narcissistic golden child who performed the role of the perfect daughter, while I was the analytical, quiet one who asked too many uncomfortable questions. I told my mother I was not sulking, but simply observing the crowd. I noted that it was quite an expensive production and asked how much Reginald was dipping into his savings for this single night of showing off. Valerie glared at me with her eyes flashing in anger. She claimed my father and she were making an essential investment in Brianna and her future. She bragged that when Brianna married into Preston's billionaire family, she would be set for life and our legacy would be secured. Valerie then told me I should be grateful they even allowed me to attend after the terrible stunt I pulled last year. Her casual reference to the accident made my blood run completely cold, but I kept my face entirely neutral. The car accident was the darkest and most twisted secret our family held. But tonight was not the night to argue about the past, because tonight was about watching their entire house of cards begin to sway. I looked past my mother and spotted Preston across the ballroom. He was holding a glass of champagne and laughing loudly at a joke. Preston wore a tuxedo that looked expensive from a distance, but my trained eyes caught the slight bunching at the shoulders, indicating it was poorly tailored. But what truly caught my attention was the silver watch gleaming on his left wrist. I softly asked my mother why a supposed billionaire technology heir was wearing a cheap replica watch. Valerie scoffed and rolled her eyes, telling me I had absolutely no idea what I was talking about. She claimed the watch was a limited edition masterpiece that his grandfather bought in Switzerland and was worth more than my entire annual salary. I tilted my head and smiled a small, knowing smile. I explained to my mother that a real mechanical watch of that caliber has a sweeping second hand that moves in a smooth, continuous motion. I pointed out that Preston's watch was ticking loudly exactly once per second, meaning it had a cheap quartz movement inside. I told her you could buy that exact counterfeit model online for about $200. Valerie stepped back as if I had physically struck her. She looked over at Preston, then back at me, her face flushing with a mixture of sudden panic and intense fury. She did not want to believe me, but she knew I never made mistakes when it came to valuing high net worth assets. Instead of questioning the man about to marry her golden child, Valerie chose to attack me. She leaned down close to my face and whispered that I was a bitter, jealous woman. She said I was miserable because I was paralyzed and alone, and could not stand the fact that a successful, wealthy man chose my sister instead of me. She hated my intelligence. The heavy wooden doors at the rear entrance of the church burst open with a deafening crash that shook the massive stained glass windows. Detective Harrison strode into the sanctuary holding a thick stack of federal warrants high in the air. A highly coordinated tactical team of local police officers and federal agents flooded through the doors behind him, their dark tactical gear creating a jarring contrast against the delicate white orchids and imported silk drapery. They moved with absolute military precision, immediately blocking every single exit in the building to ensure no one could escape the impending reckoning. The wealthy high society guests who had been screaming in outrage just moments before suddenly fell completely silent, backing away and pressing themselves against the wooden pews to clear a wide path for the advancing officers. Preston was still groaning on the carpeted floor where he had violently crashed into the pews. He tried to scramble backward like a cornered rat, his eyes darting wildly around the room for a way out, but two heavily armed federal agents were already on top of him. They grabbed his arms and forcefully wrenched them behind his back, pressing his face firmly into the cold stone floor. The fake billionaire let out a pathetic yelp of pain as the heavy steel handcuffs clicked tightly around his wrists. Detective Harrison stood over him, reading him his Miranda rights in a loud, booming voice that echoed throughout the massive church. Harrison listed the charges one by one, citing multiple counts of federal wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny. He addressed Preston by his real legal name, stripping away the fraudulent Boston technology heir persona in front of the entire Atlanta elite. The guests gasped in renewed horror as they watched the groom being hauled to his feet, his rented tuxedo torn and covered in dust, looking exactly like the desperate con artist he truly was. Down at the front of the church, Reginald was still clutching his chest, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to process the absolute destruction of his carefully curated life. Two federal agents approached my father, their expressions completely devoid of sympathy. Reginald tried to puff out his chest and use his authoritative executive voice, demanding that the officers remove their hands from his custom-tailored suit. He arrogantly stated that he was a highly respected member of the community and the head treasurer of this very church, insisting that this was all a massive misunderstanding that his expensive lawyers would easily resolve. The agents did not even blink. They grabbed my father's arms and slammed him against the wooden altar, securing his wrists in handcuffs. They informed him that the Internal Revenue Service had already seized all of his assets and that he was being formally placed under arrest for the embezzlement of $500,000 from a registered nonprofit charity. Valerie witnessed her husband being detained and completely lost her mind. My mother threw herself onto the floor, kicking her legs and screaming hysterically that they were innocent victims of a cruel conspiracy. She desperately reached out to her wealthy socialite friends in the front row, begging them to call the governor or the mayor to stop this madness. But her high society friends physically turned their backs on her, pulling their designer dresses away in disgust. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with a woman who stole money from orphans to fund a luxurious wedding. A female officer firmly grabbed Valerie by the arms and hauled her to her feet, ignoring her shrill, piercing screams. My mother was sobbing uncontrollably, her flawless makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks as the cold steel cuffs locked around her wrists, right over her expensive silk gloves. She looked absolutely pathetic, stripped of all her fake wealth and arrogant pride. The police officers marched Reginald, Valerie, and Preston straight down the center aisle, parading them in their ruined Sunday best, right past the hundreds of guests they had spent years trying to impress. The absolute humiliation was permanent and unrecoverable. I stood perfectly tall and steady on my own 2 feet, watching the people who had tortured me for years being marched out the doors to face federal prison sentences. Brianna was left completely alone at the altar. Her perfect $15,000 custom silk wedding dress was ruined, trampled by the heavy boots of the federal agents. Her elaborate veil hung lopsided from her hair, and her face was streaked with dark mascara tears. She looked around the empty altar, realizing that her fake billionaire fiancé was gone, her parents were headed to prison, and the massive bank accounts she relied on were completely frozen by the federal government. She was totally exposed, with absolutely no money, no husband, and no place to hide. Brianna slowly turned her head and looked down the aisle at me. She saw me standing tall and strong, completely unharmed and entirely victorious. She stumbled down the steps of the altar, her heavy silk dress dragging across the floor, and slowly walked toward me. The arrogant, malicious golden child, who had violently yanked me out of my wheelchair just days ago, was completely gone. In her place was a terrified, broken woman who finally realized she had absolutely nothing left. She stopped a few feet away from me, her body trembling with heavy sobs. She looked up at me with wide, pleading eyes, begging for my help. She cried that her credit cards were completely blocked, the family mansion was being seized by the government, and she had nowhere to go tonight. She pleaded with me to use my $2 million insurance payout to help her secure a hotel room and hire a defense attorney. I looked down at my younger sister, feeling absolutely no pity or remorse. I calmly reached into the pocket of my dark dress and pulled out my leather wallet. I opened it, slowly retrieved a single crisp $20 bill, and held it out toward her. Brianna stared at the small green bill in complete confusion, her tears momentarily pausing. I looked her dead in the eyes, my voice perfectly cold and steady. I told her to take an Uber. I reminded her that this was the exact same advice she gave me when she threw all of my medical equipment onto the front lawn and kicked me out of the guest house. I dropped the $20 bill onto the floor right at her feet. I turned my back on her sobbing form and walked smoothly and confidently out of the sanctuary, leaving her entirely alone to face the consequences of her own devastating cruelty. 6 months later, the blistering heat of the Atlanta summer had settled over the city, but the climate inside my life was perfectly cool and remarkably calm. The fallout from that spectacular wedding day reckoning had fundamentally reshaped the entire landscape of my existence. My parents, Reginald and Valerie, had completely lost their lengthy and highly publicized federal court battle. The mountain of digital evidence I had meticulously gathered and handed over to Detective Harrison proved to be absolutely bulletproof. The Financial Crimes Division easily tracked every single dollar my father had siphoned from the church orphanage fund, connecting it directly to my mother's extravagant country club purchases and the massive deposits on the wedding venue. The judge presiding over the case showed absolutely zero leniency for individuals who stole from charitable organizations to fund their own narcissistic vanity. Reginald and Valerie were both convicted of multiple counts of wire fraud, tax evasion, and grand larceny. They were currently serving out their 15-year mandatory sentences in separate federal penitentiaries, stripped completely of their designer clothes and their beloved high society status. The sprawling Atlanta estate they had loved to show off to their wealthy friends was swiftly foreclosed upon and sold at a public government auction to help repay the stolen church funds. Every piece of antique furniture, every luxury vehicle, and every expensive piece of jewelry my mother owned was seized and liquidated. The flawless, untouchable empire they had spent decades building upon a foundation of lies and deceit was entirely wiped off the map. Preston, the fake billionaire con artist, faced an even harsher reality. His real identity was exposed to the national media, revealing a long and pathetic history of scamming vulnerable families across the country. In addition to his lengthy federal prison sentence for attempted fraud and identity theft, the dangerous underground syndicate he owed over $1 million to was now fully aware of his exact location within the federal prison system. He would spend the rest of his miserable life looking over his shoulder, entirely consumed by the very terror he had tried to inflict upon me. As for my younger sister Brianna, her dramatic fall from grace was perhaps the most satisfying poetic justice of all. With her parents locked away and the family wealth completely eradicated, she was forced to face the real world without a single safety net. Furthermore, I had handed over the dashcam footage and the medical reports from the night of my car accident to the local authorities. The police reopened the investigation into the drunk driving crash that paralyzed me, and Brianna was formally charged with driving under the influence and vehicular assault. She managed to avoid jail time by accepting a harsh plea deal, but her pristine record was permanently destroyed. Her prestigious law school revoked her acceptance letter the moment the felony charges hit the public record. Without her golden child status or a fake billionaire husband to support her, Brianna was currently working a grueling minimum wage shift at a local fast food diner, desperately trying to scrape together enough cash to pay off her mounting legal fees and court-mandated restitution. She was living in a cramped, rundown apartment on the outskirts of the city, finally experiencing the very same helpless desperation she had so cruelly mocked me for. I did not waste a single moment looking back at the wreckage of their lives. I was far too busy building my own extraordinary future. The $2 million insurance payout, which had been safely secured in my private trust the entire time, provided the perfect foundation for my new beginning. I used the funds to officially launch my very own private firm, specializing exclusively in high-level forensic accounting and corporate fraud investigation. Word of how I had single-handedly dismantled a sophisticated embezzlement ring and exposed a federal fugitive spread rapidly through the Atlanta business sector. My professional reputation skyrocketed overnight, and wealthy clients began lining up to hire my agency to protect their own assets. I stepped out of my private elevator and walked flawlessly across the polished marble floor of my brand new office building. The sharp, confident click of my designer high heels echoed perfectly through the expansive reception area. My legs were completely healed, strong and steady, carrying me forward with an absolute sense of power and unyielding grace. I greeted my dedicated staff with a warm smile as I made my way toward the massive corner office at the end of the hall. The space was breathtaking, featuring floor-to-ceiling glass windows that offered a stunning, unobstructed panoramic view of the entire downtown Atlanta skyline. I walked over to my large mahogany desk and set down my leather briefcase. A soft knock at the open door caught my attention. Detective Harrison stood in the doorway wearing his usual sharp suit and carrying 2 steaming cups of expensive coffee. Over the past 6 months, our professional relationship had evolved into a genuine, deeply respectful friendship. He walked in handing me a cup of coffee with a warm, knowing smile. He informed me that the final asset liquidation paperwork for my parents' estate had just been officially filed, with the state courts permanently closing the final chapter on their fraudulent history. I thanked him, taking a slow sip of the hot coffee. Harrison leaned against the edge of my desk, looking out at the magnificent city view, and commented on how incredibly far I had come since that dark, terrifying night in the hospital emergency room. I smiled, turning my gaze toward the massive glass window. I looked at my own faint reflection staring back at me against the backdrop of the towering skyscrapers. I no longer saw the broken, discarded scapegoat who was forced to hide in the shadows of a wheelchair. I saw a brilliant, fiercely independent woman who had meticulously engineered her own sweet, absolute revenge. I had faced the most toxic, manipulative people in the world, and I had completely destroyed them using nothing but my own sharp mind and the undeniable power of the truth. I stood tall in my beautiful office, looking out over the city, I now conquered, feeling entirely free, extraordinarily wealthy, and completely untouchable. True strength never comes from the validation of a toxic family. It comes from trusting your mind and building absolute independence. This journey teaches us that blood does not equal loyalty. When the people supposed to protect you choose to exploit you, instead, you owe them nothing. The best revenge is not merely exposing their lies, but rising above their cruelty to create a successful life where they no longer exist. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to find your own peace? Share your story in the comments below, and please subscribe for more empowering journeys.